I think look at these are running one lane on like 4 days. Never worked
Okay, I think we'll get started. Are there any announcements? We'll have another chance for this afternoon, so it's my pleasure to introduce Colleen to you. She needs no introduction to most of you, I think, including your family members. I'd like to welcome family, sisters, boyfriends, and singular. Announcements, yes. And I'd like to welcome Peter Del Tredici, who is the outside examiner who came over from the Arnold Arboretum at Harvard. And the committee also has played a really big role in this thesis. But I want to tell you a little bit about Colleen. So Colleen graduated from Boston University in 2004. And then she did some research experiences, and then she worked as a tech doing some hardcore sort of population genetics. And she thought about, I want to go to grad school and I want to do something applied. And it was about that time that I got talking to someone about possibly doing a green roof project and thinking about, you know, Tufts has a really nice flat roof over there on the library, maybe we could try to do something. And so during, I think after Colleen had already accepted, I broached her with this topic, and she said, yeah, that sounds great. So one of the things you want to know is this person going to be a scientist, or are they going to be kind of an advocate? And so we met with this other person I'd been talking to, possibly sort of thinking about a joint project, and he was more of an advocate. And he made Colleen really uncomfortable. She says, I want to be a scientist, I don't want to be an advocate. And so we realized that we needed to go alone. So we went alone on this project, and Colleen spent a lot of time trying to think about what kinds of plants to use on the green roof, what's going to survive the harsh reality of a rooftop environment. I've always thought the one career I probably would never want would be to someone who does roofs. So she designed this wonderful experiment, and you'll hear that it was both successful and unsuccessful depending upon your perspective. And it really launched her in towards sort of a series of scientific questions that sort of examined this. And in the same process, took her into a really strong critique of the way things are generally done in the green roof community. And so she ended up presenting at conferences, getting people to really try to think, what is the science behind green roofs? And it's been a wonderful journey to watch her grow as a scientist. It's been a lot of fun to talk about these issues. It's brought together a lot of different people within the university. Joanne has been such a great supporter from the library's perspective, facilities, did lots of work trying to help set up this rooftop environment. There's been a lot of support from Tish and Ty. And so it's really a collaborative effort. And I think it just goes to tell you what you can do when you've got a community of people working together on a project. So with that, I'd like to introduce Colleen, who's going to give today's talk.
Thank you all for coming. And thank you for the very nice introduction. I'm really excited to be here and to have all my family here and my friends and colleagues, and to tell you a little bit about the research I've been doing for the past 5 years here. So one of the things we study in the Oriens lab is trees. And although my research does not actually focus on trees, I figured it would be an appropriate homage to the lab to use a tree as my conceptual model here. So we're going to keep returning to this figure throughout the talk. And some background about my research is that it really builds on a variety of disciplines, including ecology, physiology. These are my sort of areas that I know most about, and also horticulture, sustainability, architecture, engineering, a wide range of things. So I did a really big literature review, trying to figure out all these different disciplines, and then integrate that into this first survey experiment that I did. And then from there, I used those results to think about a native plant review, and also 2 more experiments about KMC3 photosynthesis and facilitation. And throughout the talk, you're going to see these little trees in the bottom left-hand corner, and these act as little signposts you can follow around and figure out how much longer you have to sit here. So first things first, the introduction. And so this is just really quick about green roofs in general, and then with each consecutive chapter, I'll give you relevant background for that. So once upon a time, long, long ago, before we were all here, there were lots of different ecosystems all over the world, and there still are, but increasingly fewer. And gradually, slowly but surely, we've replaced all these interesting ecosystems with something that looks more like this. And with this change in land use comes a variety of environmental problems, and I'm just going to talk about a couple. One of them is stormwater runoff, and so this is a really wonderful day to talk about stormwater runoff, because as you were walking here, even if you weren't thinking about it, you were surrounded by it. And so by replacing these pervious areas like forests, streams, with concrete and buildings, the rain's not able to infiltrate into the ground, and instead we have to channel it into drains and big pipes. The city of Somerville actually pays $11 million to send all of our stormwater out to Deer Island, so it's a really huge problem. Next, we have the urban heat island effect. So on a day like today, it probably sounds like a nice thing, but in reality, in summer, cities tend to be several degrees hotter than surrounding areas, largely due to that large amount of impervious surface. And lastly, this is what I'm particularly interested in, is habitat loss and degradation. Now, these are very complicated problems, and by no means is there a single solution to all of these, but one strategy that I'm particularly fond of that addresses many of these issues is green roofs, and that's what I'll be telling you about today. So the first way green roofs help is that they absorb rain. They act like a sponge, absorb the first 1 to 2 centimeters, and then release that water when the sun comes back. Second, green roofs, as plants move the water, they have a cooling effect, and if you have enough green roofs in an area, you could actually have a cooling effect for the region, city. And then lastly, this is what I'm interested in particularly, is that green roofs have the potential to function as habitat for urban wildlife. And this is something that the green roof people are really into right now. And if you go on their website, it's always listed as a benefit, but there's hardly any research yet that's focused on this. So what is a green roof? You can think of it as a very low maintenance roof garden, and I'm just showing you some of the variety of forms we have here. And you may be familiar with some of these, probably the California Academy of Sciences one. The structure looks a bit like this, and I should point out that these first several layers here, these are common in traditional roofs. You have your structural support, insulation, waterproofing. The green roof part is really up here, is these layers. And it can look a little different than this. It's basically you need some kind of drainage, something to make sure that your soil doesn't wash out into your drainage. The soil you tend to use is very lightweight, doesn't hold a lot of water, growing medium, and then my favorite part, the plants. Now about the plants, by far the most common group of plants used are sedum. And so if you've heard me talk before, you've heard all about sedum. The reason these are so popular is they're very drought tolerant, so some species have been shown to survive 88 days without water, which is pretty impressive. They're a low-growing ground cover, as you can see in this picture here. From an aesthetic point of view, that's nice because instead of looking at a dirt roof, you have a pretty planted green roof. And lastly, they're non-invasive. So that's all well and good. There's a lot of research saying that these plants are great, but as a plant ecologist, I've had the opportunity to go to lots of different ecosystems and study the diversity of plant communities, and this just seems stupid, just completely stupid. And it was probably the engineer's fault for doing this. And with classic first-year hubris, I said, I'm an ecologist, I'm going to fix this. And that brings us to our first survey. The main question here is, what is the range of plant species that can survive on a green roof? And then the second part is, does the use of a superabsorbent polymer buffer against water deficit? So we got our funding, we got permission to use the library roof, thanks to Joanne and Ron Esposito and Facilities, and hired some undergrads, Dan Brady, Merritt Gittleman, and then we set to work. Got all our planting, then we actually carry these containers with the help of the grounds crew. I don't know if John Dick's here. No. Okay, and then so we got everything up onto the roof. And a couple of years later, this is from a few months ago, this is what it looks like. So here's our study site, and a more familiar view is something like this. This is from the top of the accessible roof garden. I looked at 19 different plant species, and and I grew them with and without this super absorbent polymer. And the replicate for this experiment is this module, this thing, and that's the containers we were holding earlier. And I looked at growth and drought tolerance by looking at percent plant cover using these overhead photographs. So it was a really nice method because I could just take all the photos that summer, and then during the winter I could analyze them at my leisure. So here's our 19 species from a wide range of plant families. They have different photosynthetic systems, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Also different growth habits, which may impact their performance. And finally, they're native to different regions. And the idea behind this is that if a plant is native to the area, it will be better adapted than a plant that you're bringing from Europe. Now, as always happens with field experiments, no matter what time of year or what year you do the experiment, the weather's really weird that year. So 2007 was no exception. So we have very typical rain the first month there, a couple of days, and then we get this really dry period here where there's no rain. And in fact, it was the driest August since 1883. Yeah, so letting me on that one. But this is where it's nice to have a very optimistic advisor who sees it as a great opportunity to look at different weather patterns. So that's what we're going to do here. We're going to look at this growth during the wet period and then growth during the dry period. Here's a snapshot of what the plants look like in the middle of the wet period. You can see there's some of them are doing good, some of them not so good, but overall pretty nice. Here's the data on these. And the species are just ordered, the sedums are first, and then the others are just alphabetical order by genera. And what we see here is that there's definitely a range of growth. We have some plants that have already failed, the aster, oenothera, but a lot of the sedums and a lot of the non-sedums too are doing quite well for themselves. And in general, at this point, the superabsorbent polymer doesn't seem to have major effects. Now we'll look at the dry period. So here's the first one on the left, and then here's after the drought on the right. And you can see a little bit of that difference here. A lot of the plants are dead or about to die, and we start to notice that these sedums begin to stick out as being extra green. And now the actual data for these, and this is when the sedums really stick out. They're all doing fine, these first 4 bars, whereas all the other plants are either dead or dormant. And one of the only plants that survive throughout the summer is this little festuca here. It's a little bunch grass, but you can see it died back almost all the way. And the superabsorbent polymer didn't appear to help these plants survive this drought. In other words, after all statistical analysis, number crunching is that sedum lived and everything else died. And so the next 4 years I spent trying to figure out why this happened. Why did the sedum do so well? And also, why did everything else do so poorly? And that brings us to the natives review. And the main question here is what is driving the preference for native plants on green roofs? So when I first started, it sounded like a great idea. Everyone I talked to thought it sounded like a great idea. So then why did everything die? What happened? So more specifically, I wanted to ask these 4 questions. So who's promoting natives? How are they defining this term? Why are they doing this? Why are they promoting natives? And what is the evidence to support this? So I'd like to thank Stephanie Slowly. She was an REU in 2009. She helped a lot with scoring and categorizing. And then also my sister Erin Lamashot, is a co-author here. Hopefully I'll graduate after this. So just to show you that it's not just my roof that was native, there's actually a whole lot. So there's over 100 already that are planted with native plants. And perhaps the most famous one right now is California Academy of Sciences. And this roof has gotten a lot of positive attention, and part of that is because of its use of native plants. This is from their website explaining why. The living roof's 1.7 million native plants were specifically chosen to flourish in Golden Gate Park's climate, which makes total sense. And then you have this dark side here. And so this is from Alan Good, who presumably is the guy that actually has to take care of these plants once the famous architect is left. His opinion is a little different. So he says, if you let it go for 2 days without water, even in April, there will be a lot of dieback, the leaves will shrivel up. And this is actually a common sentiment, but very rarely do you see it written down. Normally I hear this at conferences, like in whispered tones over beer. So why is this? So our general way of picking plant communities for these biodiverse green roofs is to look to an existing community on the ground, like here, and take those plants and move them onto the roof. The problem with this idea is that we're ignoring the part of the equation that we can't see, which is the underground root system. And in many cases, these very drought-tolerant plants because they have 6 meters of roots. If you move them into 15 centimeters of really lightweight, kind of weird growing media, it's not the same environment, they're not going to thrive. And something I noticed as I was preparing this talk is just in terms of how much soil they have here versus how much plant they have here. Looks a little bit like that. So this is kind of a popular conception that you just put plants in and you don't have to worry about roots or water or anything. So the first is the who. I looked at 320 scholarly papers, so journal articles and conference papers, talking about green roofs, and identified what sort of people, what careers are working on this topic. And of those, 24% of those papers promoted the use of native plants. And we see here that there's a big career effect, which is not surprising. So our engineers down here, we only have 4 that are pro-native, which makes sense. I wouldn't really picture engineers to be on to that. Whereas architects, landscape architects, and biologists, we're going nuts over it. It's the best thing since sliced bread. So how are they defining native? And this is actually really important. So I came up with 2 main categories, biome and geographic. A biome is a habitat type, whereas geographic is any sort of spatial scale. And ideally a definition would have both of these components, but oftentimes you'll see the definition has neither of these, like our friends here at Toledo Seeds, whose definition was the planet, which is not super informative. Now, here's all of our papers, and the first thing you may notice is that there's a big white area, and this is almost 50% of the papers providing no definition at all of what they meant. So they would say, we use native plants. They're good. Of those that did provide definitions, geographic reasons seem to be the most common, although even within that there's a lot of variation. So some people would use geographic area of the building site versus North America. So there's definitely a lack of consensus on what's the relevant definition. Now, why are they promoting natives? I broke these into 2 different categories, aesthetic and scientific. Aesthetic reasons involved having to blend into the landscape or providing a sense of place. Scientific reasons I further broke down into 3 categories. The adaptation argument is that these native plants are adapted to the local environment and will consequently require less water, fertilizer, maintenance. And this is coming from ecological landscaping kind of people. The habitat argument is that native plants have co-evolved with a lot of native species and will consequently provide better quality habitat. And lastly, the invasiveness argument is that native plants, again, they've co-evolved with all these species, there's checks and balances in place, and they're less likely to become invasive. And here are the data. And what you see from this, people are better at giving reasons than they were at definitions. And by far, scientific are the most common. So if we add sort of the pink and the purple together, it's about 75% of papers are using scientific. So that's great because that's something I can actually evaluate as a scientist. Of these scientific reasons, adaptation and habitat were quite popular, whereas invasiveness was very rarely used. And so this was surprising for me and coming from an invasion biology background. Now the evidence, and this is kind of the depressing part. Here's all the papers that use these arguments, and here's the number of papers that actually bothered to test these arguments with an experiment. So let's look at those 10 papers. And I'm showing you 3 different types of growing conditions. By far the most common is the full sun and no irrigation, so we'll look at those first. And if we look, in general, we see that the native plants tended to have lower survival than the non-natives. And there's only one exception to this, Jeremy Lundholm's paper. And I should point out that he's an ecologist, and so he has a better system of choosing which plants to use. Adding irrigation or shade can also increase survival, but these are not really common conditions for most green roofs. So of all those 38 papers that use this argument, only one of them supported it, whereas the other 2 arguments, there isn't a single paper in existence that supports those. So a lot of conclusions. We have a lot of green roofs planted with natives, architects, landscapes, and biologists. The definition, there's a lack of consensus. People like scientific reasons, but there's not very much evidence. So now that I've addressed this why did everything else die argument, now we're going to look at why did sedum live. And the question is, how is sedum so successful in this novel environment? And one of the hypotheses put forth in the literature is photosynthetic plasticity. And this is a plant's ability to go from seed-free photosynthesis, which is the kind of the normal climate most plants use, to canned photosynthesis, which is a water-saving alternative method. And you can kind of think about this as the tortoise and the hare. C3 plant in good conditions, it can grow really fast, but under drought, it dies. A can plant, on the other hand, like a cactus, it just slowly and steadily grows, but it's not going to win any speed races. Now, the specific research questions: first, is there variation in photosynthetic type within the genus Sedum? Second, do Sedum species exhibit photosynthetic plasticity? And lastly, does this correlate with success on a green roof? And I'd like to acknowledge Katie Bond here, who just graduated from Tufts this last year, and she was an RU with me in 2008 and was a tremendous asset to this problem. I kind of came up with this project as a whim, and she really developed all the methods. Ross Feldberg really helped her out too, so she was a great asset and is on the paper we're working on. Now I'm going to show you the most simplified version of C3 and CAN photosynthesis ever. So this is a C3 plant. You can tell it's very realistic. Up top here is night, bottom is day. C3 plants do all this stuff during the day. So they take in carbon dioxide through their stomata, lots and lots of steps, sugar comes out. CAN photosynthesis, I know George Elmer's probably. CAN photosynthesis, the plants take in CO2 at night. The reason they do this is because they lose less water. In this C3 kind, for every gram of carbon dioxide they get, they're losing 500 grams of water, which is kind of absurd. Up here, it's much better 1:100 ratio. They cannot go straight to sugar, so what they do is they store their carbon as malic acid overnight. The next day, they can make it into sugar. So if you're trying to differentiate between these experimentally, one way to do it is to look directly at the carbon dioxide. Look during the day, at night, and see if it's moving in or out of the plant. Another way to do it is to look at the buildup of malic acid. So you can look at dawn and dusk leaf acidity of these plants. For a CAN plant, you'd expect to see a buildup of acid overnight, so at dawn, they're very acidic. And this was actually how CAN was discovered, is that people realized that when you chewed on these leaves in the morning, they're much more tart than when you chewed on it at night. This was a long, long time ago. Was it? No, I think it was, yeah, of course he is involved, he did everything. So, in this experiment, I actually measured both the acid and the CO2, and the reason for that is it allowed me to differentiate between these 4 different types of photosynthesis. So I told you about C3 and CAN. There's also these 2 other variants on CAN cycling and CAN idling, which I'll tell you about a little later. Here's the experiment. I looked at 8 different species of Sedum. These vary in growth rate, drought tolerance, growth form. Some are upright, some are prostrate, leaf morphology. They span the gamut of sedums. This all took place in the greenhouse in 2009, and I grew them in wet or dry treatments. And these are not extreme wet, extreme dry. This is kind of typical of a New England summer. The main types of measurements I did were photosynthesis, both in the forms of looking at the dawn and dusk leaf acidity, and then also looking at night and day carbon dioxide exchange. Soil moisture, I only measured just to verify that my watering treatments were in fact different. And here at the bottom here on the left, you can see these are the leaf samples for the acid measurements. And on the right, you can see this is an infrared gas analyzer connected to a chamber, and that's measuring whole plant carbon dioxide exchange. It was a huge experiment, a lot of work. I had a lot of helpers here. So again, here's Katie from 2008, and Jeremy and Kevin also helped a lot too. I can't remember, I think there was some sort of joke or something, which is why Jeremy is pouting. And then I was a good mentor, I swear. In 2009, we had 4 high school students, which was a lot of fun. Neha, who's now at BU, Olivia, who she graduated, I can't remember where she is now, Ride and Manish, who did a lot of titrations and weighing pots and everything. And then also Emily Weir was a Tufts undergrad who's working on a totally different experiment, but helped me out with some of these dawn and dusk measurements. So, here's the timeline. It's a little bit complicated, so I'll walk you through it. What we're looking at first is the top 2 rows, the water. So for 7 weeks before the experiment started, I watered all the plants twice a week to get them all growing under the same conditions. Starting week 1, I implemented the watering treatments, either 3 times a week or once a week. In weeks 4, 5, and 6, I drought stressed the plants. They weren't receiving any water. And down here, the bottom row is showing you temperature. And this is an experiment I did in the greenhouse, so I wasn't able to control the temperature, but it's definitely a factor here. And you can see that in general, especially over here, it's pretty hot, so often hotter than 40 degrees Celsius. Now first we're going to look at week 6, and I'm just looking at the dawn and dusk leaf acidity here. And this is going to show us what kind of photosynthesis these plants are doing under drought conditions. here is the nocturnal acid accumulation. A high number indicates CAM, low number indicates C3. And right away you can see there's a large variation among these species, with some of these species up here probably doing some form of CAM, whereas these ones are not really producing that much acid, probably more C3. Now in the paper you can look at all the data for all 8 species, but so I don't want to overwhelm you here, so I'm just going to focus on the 2 extreme examples. All right, now we're looking a little bit back into week 3, and this is kind of the very involved part. So we're starting measurements right here. The wet plants had been given water 3 days earlier, the dry plants 7 days earlier, so they're starting off at different points of drought. Then I give them a pulse of water and see how they respond to it. So again, here's our extreme examples, sedum album and sedum ternatum. And we can see very similar trends to that last graph I showed you, where sedum album has high acid, sedum ternatum has low. One of the most interesting things I think here is that there's no difference between these watering treatments. And that's interesting because I can show you this